Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And now we have our Booker Prize Longlist for 2025, and this book, Flesh by David Szalay, is one of them. So I'm really excited to be talking a bit about this book. It's one that was one of my favourites going into this. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about it. I will go into some spoilers eventually. I'll do the first section without spoilers as much as possible, and then do a little bit that goes into some of the spoilers. But yeah, really excited to talk about this book. So the book focuses on a character called Istvan, and we learn a lot about him through his life as he goes, but we are mostly told the story through his lens. Although he's not directly talking to us, we only really hear his thoughts, and we only really get a narrative style that feels like it's coming from him. And so all the way through this book, structurally and kind of the narrative way that this is framed is an incredibly clipped and short version of events. So we never get a lengthy sentence going into the details of every single thing that happened and the colour of the sky and what smells he could smell or what he could hear. Instead, we just get the very basic details, and in some ways he closes off more and more as the book goes along. And particularly the book focuses on what it means to be a young man, and particularly in his case, what masculinity and maleness looks like when you are just trying to keep your head above water. So as a young man, Istvan is at the centre of a number of incidents, some of which are his fault, some of which are can almost be chalked up to him being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But essentially he starts by essentially there's some kind of affair that he is involved in, and this leads to situations where he has to make some very snap judgments about what he's going to do next. It ends up in a series of events that means that he is unable to follow a more traditional route early on. He is potentially seen as a criminal. Well, he is seen as a criminal, and he goes through juvenile sort of delinquent sort of places. He's sort of treated like a young criminal, and he goes through that system. But particularly with the way that this book is framed and the narrative style that's very short, very almost unbothered about details, we get these little snippets into what's happening in his life and the ways that he closes off to the world around him. There's a sense when he's younger that there's a little bit more possibility and a little bit more excitement, and what he has to sort of settle for instead is a life where he never quite reveals too much about himself, because to show any kind of vulnerability is dangerous, not only because of his past history and what that might mean in terms of having a criminal record and looking for work, but also what that might look like for dating in terms of revealing that you've got this darker past. But also all on top of that is this idea of what it means to be a man for him in the book. And there's a very sort of rigid sense of what it means to be a man for him. That is very much someone who doesn't show much emotion outwardly, who doesn't ever lose control, who is very much just sort of working as much as he can, is just putting money away, is just being sensible and logical, and all of these things. All of that plays into his idea and his notions of what it means to be a man. And I found this really interesting, particularly given the other book I've read by this author, All That Man Is, which is a set of interconnected narratives that really explores masculinity and maleness. And it's really interesting when you see an author who has maybe not an obsession, but a real interest in a specific idea, and kind of goes with that and explores that in various ways. And so what we see in this book is an interrogation of the various ways that being a man or wanting to be seen as masculine or macho can impede somebody's life. Because what we see is a man who in many ways is not really present in much of the world that's going on around him. Things happen to him in this book, or happen around him. He takes on a job, he watches as the job happens, his colleagues and co-workers try to occasionally engage with him, or maybe there's a woman who's interested in him, and nothing really of his life ever comes out. He has affairs with women, but it's purely sexual, and there seems to be almost no emotional connection to it. And there's something really fascinating about the way that the book's narrative works with that. So to give an example that I don't think is a spoiler, at one point in the book, a really dramatic life moment happens to him involving a relationship that he is in. And from the end of one chapter to the beginning of the next chapter, several years pass in which something quite dramatic happens in that relationship. And this happens several times in the book. And what we see is he is almost completely unflappable and unfazed by everything that's happened with that part of the relationship. A whole situation could have happened and he watches it happen, but doesn't feel the need to tell us as the sort of narrator or the kind of main character of this book. And whereas it's interesting to position that alongside other books where we might have a character grapple with the idea of what it might mean to be in a relationship with somebody, what it might mean to consider being married, or to think about loss and grief, or to think about wanting children, or all of those things. We might see male characters in other books grapple with those and play around with those, and perhaps even still have a strong sense of what the masculine male role is, but to do so through quite a descriptive narrative style, or even to have that shown more through action or through whatever else. And in this book, we almost get an intentional withdrawal of that. We don't see a lot of these big life moments happen for him in the book. It's almost as if they are just small footnotes in something else that's happening in his life. He is in some ways not really the main character in his own life. He is just going through the motions and doing things. And the book, I think, does so really interestingly in terms of drawing lines between his history and that, of, this idea of, is he this guarded and withdrawn because the few times where he wasn't earlier in life, that really potentially could have derailed his whole life, or because he had this the sort of criminal conviction early on, and that's shaped how he approaches everything else, where he's more cut off? Or is it that he has just sort of grown into the type of man that he thinks he is meant to be, and is just performing that role to his best ability? And there are all these little moments where he is more able to engage with these things that I found fascinating. But even then there's a distance. And I think there's something so interesting about the way this book uses psychological distance between the main character and what's going on, and between people in his life, that I think does so much more than a really descriptive passage might ever do. And with that, I want to go into speaking a bit about spoilers. But I found this book so fascinating in so many ways. I loved this. I thought it was incredibly daring to have a character intentionally hold things back from the reader that they would want. This is not a main character who is at all invested in giving us a full story, of telling us all the details, of making us feel better about some of the dark moments, or helping us navigate or understand other things. The main character does not care. He is in many ways a character without a book or without a reader. He doesn't seem to exist to be read as a character. He seems to exist as a real person who is not fazed at all about any other narratives that people have around him. And I found that fascinating as a narrative and literary device in this book. So yeah, I urge you to go and check this out if you think it would be of interest. But with that in mind, let's get talking about some of the spoilers. So with spoilers in effect, I think this book does something then really clever with how it moves the narrative on further. So the beginning part of the book is him in Hungary with his mother, and this is where the criminal convictions and difficult things happen. And we learn that he is quite cut off and isolated from a few people around him. He doesn't quite understand what it's like to be like the other boys, and he never quite engages with that. But then he moves to London and sort of tries to have a new life. And in many ways, this book then plays with this idea of an immigrant journey, this idea of he is now this person who's moved to London, has got a very high-paying job, given what he was doing previously, and this seems to be a new chance to start over. And this is a job working sort of as a, sort of drive and partly sort of security guard-esque things that he's doing. He does sort of a few odd jobs, but the idea seems to be that there is something more illicit going on, and that a part of his pay is being paid to just look the other way. And so in some ways, again, his stoicism or quiet nature or lack of interest in being involved in other people's lives is an asset for him. This is part of how he survives in this world. And he starts earning a really good amount of money, but he is not flashy about it. He does not spend that money on buying all the fanciest things or feeling like he's really made it. He just kind of keeps plugging away, doing what he's doing, and he's now comfortable. And that's one thing that's off his mind now. He doesn't have to worry about money in quite the same way. He is just able to live and get by. But he starts an affair with somebody. He's with the wife of the man he's working for, or kind of as part of that. And he is incredibly detached in the way he talks about this. He often will talk about these moments of them having sex together as sort of being like, yeah, you know, I'll let's go and have sex maybe. Yeah, we'll do that. That'll be that's the evening. And there's a dispassionate way that he talks about it that feels slightly different from some of the women earlier in the story, where he is a little bit less guarded perhaps. And so it feels that he's learned that this psychological distance is the only way to make it through. But this then yields some other things. And I mentioned earlier how whole things will change over a chapter, and the spaces in between a chapter. In one of those, we see the woman who he's been with dying. We also see a child being born at one point, and we just sort of meet them as a toddler. We see all of these other things happening, but these big life moments that for other characters would be the big triumphant bit at the end of the book, or a really beautiful moment, or a moment filled with complexity of feelings. In this book, those don't exist. It just happens. These are big life moments, and they are just another fact to add to his list. He is now also a father. He is now also somebody whose partner has died. All of these things. And he just moves through the book in a way that you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of what this book's going to be doing. And you don't quite know where this is then going to go, because he's in many ways kept us at arm's length. Both the character Istvan and David Szalay, the author, have kept us at arm's length throughout the book. And so in some ways this ending is both something that makes a lot of sense, where he has some feeling of returning home and trying to continue a life there in Hungary now that he's quote unquote made it in the UK. But also he has a sort of, he's pretty neutral about most of this. There isn't a strong sense of a feeling of missing London now that he's going to leave it, or being really excited about going back home. We kind of get nothing from him again. And the book then, in some ways, it's an ending that both makes a lot of sense, because that's entirely consistent with how he's been for the rest of the novel, but also feels so interesting because we are robbed in some ways of a typical ending. And I think that's all so intentional and so well done in this book, that we are meant to treat him as some kind of distant person who we aren't meant to know. We get these little insights into him. We see these tender moments with his son, and him feeling a sense of how he's going to role model being a good father to this young man. What does it mean to be a man? How am I going to show that to my child? But then that's kind of it. He doesn't really take us on that journey himself. And I think that's what's so impactful here in this book, is in some ways that feels like a commentary itself, not only on masculinity and maleness and the ways that we often cut out those parts for a lot of men, that we make it quite difficult for men often to talk about feelings, or that we make it difficult for men to be treated with seriousness when they talk about feelings or what's going on in their lives. The idea that actually there could have been other men in Istvan's life who would have asked him about what it's like to have been married. You know, how was your wedding? How was it when your partner died? How was it when you had a child? You know, all of these are such big moments. And the noticeable thing is that we don't have people, and particularly men in this book, who are asking him those questions as well. But I think there's also something here about this idea of redemption, of what it means based on the beginning of the book. He is an outcast early on. He then does something that makes him not only an outcast to his set of friends, but also socially an outcast because he's a criminal and all of these other things. And what that might psychologically do to someone who then realizes that their only way to make it through life is to just do everything correctly, do everything by the book, do exactly what is needed to make it through this thing called life, and not to be vulnerable or not to let anybody else in, because that's where the danger might be. And that in and of itself, I think, feels like an incredibly important and salient point that the book is driving at, that there is something there about what it means to live a good life, or a life that is respected well by others. And that is often, in this case, particularly a flawless life, that you have to hit all the big moments of what we expect, the sort of the rites of passage in a life to be deemed worthy. And if you hit those, some people will pat you on the back and say, well done, you got married, you had a kid, you did all the right things. But it doesn't mean necessarily that it's a life he wanted to lead, or it's a life that bears any further conversation for him. And so I think there's so much that's going on in this book, both in terms of the plot and the narrative itself and the way that's held off for us, but also this style, I think, is the most fascinating thing here for this book, of how we are kept at a distance in the same way that this man has been kept at a distance from his own life, or from his own sense of self. And I think that's fascinating. Anyway, this has been a very long ramble about this book, but I loved this. I think this is such an intelligent use of fiction to deliver a message, or to have a conversation about something. And I'm really intrigued now to go and read other books by this author, because the two now that I've read, I've really enjoyed. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop rambling about the book. Take care, and I hope you enjoy reading this book. I'll be talking more about the rest of the long list as well as we go. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.